Hi everyone. We're just letting everyone in, so we'll get started in a couple of seconds. Okay, I will get started as more people join. But hi everyone, I'm Sarah, DV New South Wales' Sector Development Manager. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the land of the Darkinjung people where I'm coming from today, and also acknowledge all the lands we are calling in from, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd further like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal folk with us here today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So today we have two wonderful guest speakers, Karina Noble and Sal Rogers, to talk about disability and housing. Women living with disability are 2 times more likely than women without disability to experience domestic violence. However, there can often be many barriers to accessing support and services, insights that Karina and Sal will share more about in this sector chat, along with resources for DFB services to make their services safer and more available to women and children with disability. Before I jump into welcoming our fab speakers, I'd like to share some DV New South Wales updates. It's been another busy month here at DV New South Wales. We've had Delia and Elise out meeting with MPs and shadow MPs across New South Wales to ensure we have their support on sector priorities and the outcomes that we really want to see for our members across the state, particularly our funding ask now that we now move on to the next budget. We've recently met with Women's Safety Team at DCJ for an update on the 148 frontline worker funding. A lot of feedback from the sector has been taken on board, and DCJ are currently drafting the procurement plan in consultation with local districts. The plan will be nuanced and be relevant to different regions, and DCJ is working to commence a procurement process in November, noting the Christmas period, and it's anticipated that this procurement process will be complete by February 2024, and contracts will be awarded in April 2024. However, we'll keep you updated as we hear more on this as well. Also, a reminder that the New South Wales Domestic and Family Violence Workforce Baseline Survey is currently open, and that closes next month on the 12th of November. And this survey really is about creating an evidence base to inform DFE workforce planning and where best to direct resources to support workers who respond to DFE. So it would be amazing to have as many practitioners as possible complete that, and we'll put the link in the chat now as well, so you have that. Some updates from my area around sector development. We're currently working on developing a training session on working with children and young people experiencing domestic and family violence, as well as a series of films to support each of the Good Practice Guideline principles. So we'll keep you updated as these projects and many other capacity building projects progress. But I just wanted to do a huge shout out and big thanks to our DV New South Wales Sector Development Member Advisory Committee members for all of their input and collaboration. It's been really a great sort of co-design on many of these projects. Finally, we hope you already have this date marked in your calendar, but just a reminder to save the date for our conference next year, which will be on the 18th and 19th of September. So now on to our wonderful speakers, Karina Noble and Sal Rogers. Sal has over 20 years experience working in the human services sector, specialising in child protection and trauma. She has experience in clinical positions in mental health, as well as legislation, policy, advice and training, and has been instrumental in the advice and development of key initiatives that advance the rights of First Nations people and also non-Aboriginal people. Sal has been consulting in the advocacy space and utilises trauma-informed ethical frameworks and consumer participation strategies as a foundation to her practice. We are also thrilled to have Sal as a consultant to work on cultural competency within DV New South Wales. Karina is an autistic queer woman with multiple disabilities. She's currently managing 2 projects at People with Disability Australia, the Building Access Project and Advancing Women with Disabilities in the Workplace. Karina has extensive knowledge in the not-for-profit and disability sectors and is an established leader in business as an advocate for long-term social change. We're so looking forward to this session with you both. So big thank you, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Sal and I are going to talk to you today about the Building Access Project and also what that means, you know, for the sector and what that means for someone experiencing violence and what that looks like as they try to access services. So I am calling from Whadjuk country over in the west, and just would like to acknowledge the owners of these lands here, the Whadjuk Nyoongar people, and extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. I would also like to acknowledge anyone here with lived experience of violence and or lived experience of disability. And as we go through the discussion today, you take breaks as you need, and if you need to turn cameras on, off, or leave, you are welcome to do that. And at the end, we will provide some support numbers as well to Blue Knot and also the DSS counselling and referral services. So we're here to talk about making services in the domestic and family violence sector and also the housing sector safer and more available to people with disability, particularly women and gender diverse folk with disability. And the Building Access Project was designed to enable services to better meet the needs, to make services more accessible and better meet the needs of women and children with disability. A bunch of resources were created, which I'll share with you later on, with DV New South Wales, which are excellent resources and really tangible and usable for the sector and for your workplace and individually. And for the last 6 months of the project, we conducted some research with women with disability and also service providers. And I've seen some of you in the audience today, some of the members of DV New South Wales who participated in this project. From this research comes the foundation of what we're going to speak about today. For some context, for those of you, most of you will know the statistics that women with disability experience higher rates of violence and more frequently than women without disability, 40% more in an adult life, actually. And the violence experienced is unique, is often unique and is complex. There are unique forms of violence experienced by women with disability. And these can include things like physical abuse, having medications or mobility aids withheld or broken, the use of chemical or physical restraints. And so there's a whole myriad of things experienced by women with disability in the context of violence that aren't necessarily experienced by women without disability. And it can make accessing services more complicated, but it also means that women with disability also have less avenues to support. And we see this in areas of particularly independent living arrangements, ostensibly group homes, and other places where women with disability experience violence and quite often do not have access or ready access to the reporting pathways or service pathways that would be available to people without disability. And many places deal with these disclosures of violence internally rather than criminally, for example.
Yes.
So, yeah, and Sal's going to speak about that a little bit later on. So in a 12-month period, just to give you an idea, so we talk about women with disability not only experiencing higher rates of violence, but more frequently and often from multiple perpetrators. So in a 12-month period, this was data from 2016, but is consistently seen in recent years. 24% of First Nations women with disability experience physical or threatened violence, so coercive violence. And 46% of the LGBTQ plus community who reported violence had a disability. So they're significant statistics. And I want you to bear this in mind contextually as we start to talk about the barriers, because these higher rates of violence you may know about, but when you think about who is presenting at services, who is coming to services, who is accessing services, are these statistics reflected in the people who are reaching your services? Just want to touch on the Disability Royal Commission. Many of you would have heard that the final report was recently released at the end of September. And the Disability Royal Commission looked into, they investigated preventing and better protecting people with disability from experiencing violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation. They looked at achieving best practice in reporting and investigating and responding to those things. And they wanted to have a look at how to promote a more inclusive society that supports people with disability to be independent and live free from violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation. Before the final report was released, they called for the end of restrictive practices. So some of those things that I spoke about before, like using, for example, chemical or physical restraints. And also a couple of weeks ago for the end of segregation. These are two key and important things that contravene human rights. And we want to make sure that when we're thinking about becoming more inclusive and creating more accessible services for people with disability, that we're not just doing this as a nice thing to do. This is people's fundamental human rights. It's embedded in the conventions of the rights of people with disability. And it's increasingly being written into legislation in New South Wales, federally and across other states and territories. There were 222 recommendations for change from the DRC, and Lisa is going to pop into the chat a brief guide to the report and also a link to the full report if you have a few days to sit through and get through the full report, but otherwise reading the guide is also quite useful and a good summary. The overall vision for inclusion as from the recommendations is that human rights are protected and that individuals can live with dignity, equality and respect, free from violence and exploitation.
Yep.
So, yeah, that's a little bit of context, and Sal's going to have a chat to you now about housing and disability.
Okay, so looking at women and disability and housing, one of the key findings of that AURU report, so the Australian Housing Urban Rural Institute 2017, one of the key findings were design codes. The majority of houses and units do not meet the accessibility or visibility requirements including dignified access, which includes the ability to access building spaces and facilities using a wheelchair. So, for example, this highlights the importance of housing providers knowing the difference between accessible housing and modifiable housing. There's another example of this is it's not uncommon for housing providers to house people with disabilities with wheelchairs on floors that are not on the ground floor. This becomes problematic and dangerous for the person with disabilities and other tenants. Other examples to mention are the door access, so there's no disability door downstairs, the lift breakdowns, and fire and emergency procedures. Housing providers will often tell consumers that their tenancy meets silver standards. However, I know many service providers send workers out to access their accommodation. I'm interested to know how many services come across this issue when working with people with disabilities and domestic violence survivors in housing.
Thanks, Sal. Yeah, so When we're talking about housing, you know, one of the recommendations that came out of our research for building access was that short-term housing and emergency accommodation in the housing sector and also the domestic and family violence sector must have accessible pathways to long-term housing, because women with disability experiencing violence have like we will speak about, a lot of barriers already, but then they have these additional barriers of not being able to have access to housing that, you know, is something that they can live in short term and long term. And it's a huge factor, as I'm sure most of you know, why women are unable to actually leave situations of violence. And quite often there's no viable option for them to leave. So when we did the research, we basically were looking at what are the barriers to access, and we realised that there's a whole range of barriers that happen before someone even gets to either a literal or metaphorical door of a service. We call these pre-access barriers. Because of the society we live in, the ableism in our society and the discrimination in our society across many different areas, fear and mistrust was something that was mentioned over and over by women with disability. Fear of having children removed from their care, for example, when disclosing violence, because women are not often seen, women with disability are not seen as credible witnesses in their own experiences of violence. Yes. And a mistrust of the systems to handle their disclosure appropriately because of the way they've been treated in the past. Those negative past experiences can involve systems. It can involve, for example, we spoke to one person whose parent had disclosed violence when they were a teenager, and they saw their parent actually be institutionalized for mental health when they disclosed violence. And that, again, that witnessing was used against them. And so that meant that, along with other experiences as a disabled woman as they navigated their life, they felt unable to disclose violence when it was perpetrated against them because of their experiences of seeing what happened to their mum, but also working in the sector and seeing, just the constant dismissal and the way that people with disability were treated. A lack of support after disclosure. I talk about dismissal a lot because it's really important. One of the things that not realising abuse, women with disability often don't realise they're experiencing abuse because either they're told that they're told that is how abuse is experienced. This is normal. This is what everyone experiences. They're gaslit, essentially. But also when they do disclose or they start to talk, that they're dismissed, that is not believed or actually just actively dismissed, or they're not receiving appropriate pathways to support because the people they're disclosing to don't know how to support them appropriately.
Yeah.
The access is difficult or not available, as you can imagine. There are many barriers, and one thing that gets overlooked is the complexity of bureaucratic systems, the siloing of different support systems, which we hopefully something like Core and Cluster will start to address with a wraparound, but that this is exhausting and makes access very difficult with women with disability who are already navigating all of the things they need to do in their everyday lives to navigate their disability, extra medical appointments, for example. And then when you try and add in the complete burden of trying to access services and the task of that being put back onto the people with disability, it's actually quite exhausting. Informational accessibility, that can be a barrier. If someone can't access, information about your service, that is a huge thing for some people. Again, the exhaustion of trying to find ways around that accessibility. And a couple of things that were noted was confidentiality concerns, that, again, this culture of women with disability being dismissed. For example, not being spoken to, speaking to a support worker rather than the person with disability about their experiences. Yeah. And that the confidentiality of those disclosures actually not being respected in a way that is just not the case for people without disability. You know, always being aware of who's in the room, who are you speaking to, and what questions have you asked and what have you offered that person with disabilities to ensure that they're in control of their own experience and privacy. Financial, most of you will know that that people with disability live in a very low income bracket, a lot of people, disproportionately so, and that actually those extra financial burdens can be a significant barrier to access something as simple as in a rural area not being able to put petrol in the car to get to the regional centre where services are, for example.
Could I just extend on that too, Karina?
Yeah,
it's financial abuse as well. So when you have a disability and you're accessing services and you're accessing support workers, they will see you as a cash cow. So they will, and that's how you're treated. So you're negotiating, you know, with people who don't have qualifications, coming off the street, getting paid $62.50 an hour to open a door for somebody. You know, so so the assessment process, like that door would have been assessed about 50 times with the tenants that would live here that have disabilities. And where does that money go? Where does that data go? It's not sitting with the housing provider. It's not sitting with NDIS. So it's an abuse of funds, and it's also it's financial abuse of people with disabilities.
Yeah, thanks, Sal. And that was something that came out, in our research, that there are actually, again, that unique and complex forms of violence. So when we're talking about financial abuse, there are ways that people with disability experience that abuse that people without disability do not. So that needs, the awareness and education around that needs to be there. And again, it's about asking the right questions when someone is accessing a service, asking them in a trauma-informed way, but so that we can start to build a picture of the actual, the reality and the types of violence that are being experienced. Here are some quotes from the research, so the one-on-one interviews with women experiencing violence. So talking about the exhaustion, I was unable to get out of bed or shower, let alone make an email or research things on a website. Waiting and calling takes hours. It was exhausting. Being disabled in an able-bodied world is honestly exhausting. I can't stress this enough. Services need to be flexible and to be able to communicate, but to be able to accommodate women with disability by coming to them or organising support that doesn't involve lengthy trips and waits. Many of the systems and processes are prohibitive for women with disability. And people feel you're unworthy of being listened to. Feeling like doors just shutting in my face because I was only seen as a wheelchair user, seen only as a disabled person. And that really did impact my confidence, I guess, to bother reaching out and looking for assistance with the domestic violence. This person became a wheelchair user overnight. And so the contrast between the way that they were treated as an able-bodied person and then as a wheelchair user was very clear to them and started to really impact the way they thought about themselves and the way that they experienced the world. When they experienced significant violence, they chose not to disclose at the time because they were scared of having their children removed from their care because of the way they had been treated in their workplace. They had seen at school that all of a sudden they had been perceived as a person who was incapable of parenting because they were a wheelchair user. And so they were too scared to actually reach out for support with the violence. This was a common story. And Sal's going to speak to that.
So can you just go back to that previous quote?
Absolutely.
On that quote, I can relate massively to this. I'm a new wheelchair user, so I experienced this a lot. Being industry trained for like 20 plus years, the disability sector per se has frustrated frustrated me professionally, so I've stayed out of it. So actually being a consumer now and being trained in human services and knowing how agencies are supposed to deliver services and they don't. So I'm in a wheelchair, yet people will speak to me like this. There's nothing wrong with my mind, like my mouth. There's nothing wrong with me being able to hear what you're saying, but people will treat you like that. And then on top of that, if you experience domestic violence, and it's same-sex domestic violence, that is often ignored, removed, and the disability is the only focus. So the discrepancy between how people are treated in a in an able-bodied world versus a non-able-bodied world is a huge adjustment. And then on top of that, you've got the adjustment of trying to heal from the domestic violence and then trying to deal with what it's left with you physically. Yeah, so just continuing on from that from my side. So the next slide from me, guys. Thank you. So in many of the reports around First Nations peoples, whether it's housing and disability and health and education and violence, cultural safety isn't a key focus and isn't a guiding principle. So what do we actually mean by cultural safety? Cultural safety is the positive recognition and celebration of cultures. It is more than the absence of racism or discrimination and more than cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity. It empowers First Nations people and enables them to contribute and feel safe to be themselves. Like Karina mentioned before, it is a legislative requirement. Cultural safety is a human right and a legislative requirement. The UN Convention on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I think Australia has signed, and we're in breach. Everyone is responsible for the cultural safety of First Nations people in their organisations and how they work with First Nations staff, consumers and external stakeholders. So I'd like to throw a challenge out there to service providers who are attending today, and I would encourage service providers to look and reassess their cultural safety frameworks in light of this presentation today. Further examples of foundational barriers for people living with a disability, and Karina has touched on some of these earlier on, and the quotes sum up them perfectly, is attitudes has got to be is one of the significant foundational barriers. People's perceptions of what it is like for people to live with a disability, like I said before, the amount of times I get spoken to like this is absolutely insane. It is incredibly disrespectful. It is inhumane. You wouldn't see it in any other area, or you would challenge it if you did in service provision, but we tend to just allow this to happen. All disabilities affect people differently. Stigma, stereotyping, discrimination and prejudice play a huge role in people with disabilities and their ability to participate in everyday life. So how you speak to them, how you allow them to participate, what participatory support strategies you develop that enable them to engage and understand what they're participating in and having a say on. Some of the obvious barriers to communication with people with disabilities, it involves anything to do with reading, writing, speaking. This could include videos that don't include captioning, no large printing. And I think the other one is technical language, and we're renowned in this sector in human services for coming up with our own language. So the technical language that prevents someone who thinks differently from understanding a message is, I think, very powerful as well. Physical barriers are obviously, structures that prevent or block mobility and access. And some examples were given where, previously, tenants are housed on floors that aren't on the ground floor. I've personally attended, which I was absolutely flabbergasted. I attended an NDIS provided service, and it did not have an accessible entrance for a wheelchair user, yet it was an NDIS approved service provider. Another thing is that overreaction versus non-reaction. So attitude in the sector, if you're advocating for yourself, or if clients are advocating for themselves, particularly if you're challenging something, at times that challenge can be perceived as egotistical or being constantly told you're activated, so you're constantly getting dismissed and gaslit. Therefore, no outcome is ever derived on the need that you're wanting a response to, and this definitely is not person-centered and trauma-informed. I also want to just add that my experience of being new to disabilities, I have to give space to, sometimes people just don't know how to react or respond to people with people with a disability in an able-bodied world. And I think that we need to hold space for that as well. I think that the world needs to catch up, but I also believe that, you know, some people just generally don't know because they don't know. Over to you, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Sal. And it's interesting because when you're speaking to those experiences, I sat here thinking, a question we can ask ourselves is who are you excluding from conversations due to your own internal biases? You know, and Sal spoke to some of the things that people with disability experience navigating the world to their face. But also another part of this is where are we being excluded? You know, who are you excluding from conversations? Who are you excluding due to existing hierarchies and power dynamics, you know, that are inherent to the way that our society is built, but we actually have to examine to, you know, ensure that we are being inclusive. It doesn't happen just because we want it to. It has to be intentional.
Can I add something there? Can I add
Yeah.
something there? Organisationally, I had the opportunity of training my rehab centre. They wanted me to train all their 3 centres. And one of the biggest points that I wanted to drive home with them was to feel comfortable to have those closed conversations to unpack your unconscious bias, because if you do that as organisationally, that's going to inform your practice, it's going to inform your theory, your practice, your values, your work. And therefore it's gonna massively change outcomes for people with disabilities.
Yeah, agreed. And one of those, so moving on to the access barriers, one of those ways where that can have an impact is on intake procedures, asking the right questions in a way that's accessible, but also in a way that allows people to disclose disability if they choose to and not to if they don't want to. It is a huge barrier for people, and it sets the tone for people to understand whether or not your organisation is a safe and available space to them. And that covers a whole range of things and not just disability. Because our research showed that still today, many people with disability do not feel welcome when accessing services. And that is not okay. That's not good enough. It's also unbelievable, right? Like that just, but the amount that came up was significant. Physical accessibility, of course, you know, which Sal just mentioned. I mean, that again, that a service is a disability provider, but yet not physically accessible for a wheelchair user. And again, we understand in the domestic and family violence sector, particularly, many people are working out of older buildings. You know, we're working out of the spaces that were given, and that's what we've got. So I want to acknowledge that we're not working with a perfect model. The system we're not working with, it's not perfect, but the tendency is to go, well, we're not physically accessible, so I'll just put that in the too hard basket and instead we won't look at it at all. When actually, as Sal mentioned, the biggest barrier is attitude. And so if we can increase attitudinal accessibility, other forms of accessibility follow. And at least you can have those conversations and be upfront and be like, hey, this is where we are accessible. Unfortunately, we're not accessible in this way for these specific mobility devices, for example. But you can be specific and tell people where but at least you are acknowledging it, and you become a safe and accessible place for people to at least have the conversations. You might then be able to refer them to someone who is physically accessible for them, and that they have at least come into the service system and be able to access help. The complicated and overburdened systems, we all know, we all know those systems all too well. But people in our research that we interviewed, they told us that exhaustion of going between the mental health system, domestic and family violence, you know, separating into the legal system, and it was just also siloed and became very difficult to navigate emotionally, physically, and also economically. You know, taking into account these little economic factors that even though services might be free, it costs money to get there, it costs money to drive there, it costs money to get someone to look after the kids. You know, there's a whole range of financial costs. And sometimes there are no viable options to leave for people with disability. There's actually no viable pathway for housing, for example, or support. Support workers and carers can be an access barrier. We need to be aware of this, that often the violence is being perpetrated by people who are support workers, carers, family carers, and that they may be in the room when, you know, these supports are being accessed, and that full stories may not be being told. So just having that awareness, because that is the worst case scenario, that as a barrier, but also support workers can be a barrier without intending to be. It's not an intentional thing, but it's ensuring that you're having those conversations with the people who are coming to access your service and not their support workers exclusively. And regional, rural, and remote, we all know that services, the challenges faced by services, but also for the people living in these areas are compounded. Those barriers are compounded. It came up a lot, and it came up in regards to privacy and confidentiality a lot more than we were expecting. So this was one of the main concerns about disclosing and escaping violence in rural and remote regions. So yeah, 71% of the interviewers agreed that they have not felt welcome when considering all of their experiences in the domestic and family violence sector. So that's significant.
And that would be really reflective of that number. Like, it would be high. I
huge.
People at rehabs, like, I don't shut up, so I yarn to everybody, and I'm really interested in their story and interested in the way that they navigate this system. And it's really, like, the percentage is huge. And even though the service provider might be really welcoming, there'll be certain things that will be obvious to a person in a wheelchair or a person with a disability that doesn't make it comfortable.
Yeah.
So for example, just touching on this, I asked the rehab centre what were their trauma-informed practices, and the response was they thought I was asking how they respond to me and trauma, and I went, no, I'm asking you how you do your business and how you show up. And then I rattled off, I was able to rattle off, 2 or 3 key trauma-informed practices that they use, and then the director got it and went, oh, okay, I got what you mean. So it's just a massive disconnect from that as well. Like, allied health services and rehab services aren't trained enough around domestic and family violence, and they do feel like it's a solo thing, and it's not their area to address. I'm going to just, because I can just
and that's where ensuring that your referring services understand your accessibility, and that they understand where the appropriate referral pathways are too. So you need to ensure that you have good connections with those networks, and signal your safety. For example, having easy read resources in your referring organisations, so that people know that you're a safe place to be referred to. So there's many different ways. In the ways that, for example, we use the rainbow tick to signal safety in the LGBTQ+ community, that you're signaling that and thinking about ways that you can make it known that your space is safe and available. If not perfectly accessible, it's safe and available to people with disability. Oh, sorry,
for example, Sunflower Lane. Have you heard of that? I didn't find out about it from Disability Services. I actually found out about it from Qantas when I was trying to book a flight. And the Sunflower Langdon is something. It's to identify non-visible disabilities.
Yes.
But interesting that I found that out about from Qantas and not from a service provider.
I'm just going to read this quote, Sal, because I know you wanted to speak to this as well. And this was from one of the people we interviewed. If I present as an Aboriginal woman with a walking stick, I get very different treatment than if I present as doctor and physically capable of walking.
Yes. Do you want me to add comments?
Yes.
Yeah? I at times, and this is a really horrible thing to have to experience personally, but I at times choose when to identify and when not to identify because of the systems. Sorry, I'm just reading the pop-up. No.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Sorry, can you just remind me where I was at? This is my brain injury,
yeah,
guys.
so talking about the different treatment depending on how you present.
Yeah, so at times
whether you identify or not, Sal,
yeah,
as an Aboriginal person.
Thanks, Bubs. Yeah, so I choose not to identify based on how I know I'm going to get a service delivered to me or not, and at other times I will identify. Most of the time, I'm being really honest, I will choose not to identify, so I don't get lumped in with all the stereotypes and stigma, because there's already enough things that I'm fluffing through and navigating and trying to balance, juggle in the air regarding the disability in the first place and navigating that.
That's very real for people with disability as well, and those invisible disabilities you spoke about, choosing when to disclose. And some people don't obviously have that privilege of choosing when to disclose. Yeah.
And I think, for an Aboriginal person, I think that's horrible that I had to that I feel that way. And the reason I'm choosing to share it today, because I hope it punches in the heart and it gets service providers thinking about the impact that they can have on a person with disabilities entering their service. Attitudes, massively important.
Yeah. And I'm wary of time, so I'm going to
do you want me to skim through?
I was going to get to the access, so talking about services. Did you want to quickly touch on this part, Sal?
That one there?
Yeah.
So continuation of barriers from me is one thing that clients get told a lot of is that their disability is complex. My challenge and response to service providers all the times is, hang on a second, my disability is quite clear. It's not my disability that's complex. It's the systemic systems that I experience that are complex and abusive. So again, relationships, very, very, very important. If you're needing a report for, in advocacy or something like that, and an allied health professional is only focused on their treatment plan of your rehab, and they're not getting the fact that the lifts break down, so that stops your consistency to rock up to therapy. And so I challenge them back with the whole multidisciplinary team response and looking at a person holistically. I'm going to skim through these because I'm wary of the time. Inconsistencies of service delivery. For example, locking in a treatment plan and locking in support workers changes when NDIS plans are reviewed. This makes it very hard to secure consistent and appropriate responses to the needs of people with disabilities.
Yeah.
So next point.
And the research showed that as well. We interviewed some people and they talked about when they disclose violence or were trying to leave, for example, a rural area and come back to an urban area, that they had to transfer their services and they were left at the most vulnerable time without their support services, because they wanted to make sure they were ready and available when they moved to the new location. And it was that again, it came up. And it was that gap is significant and just not necessary.
No, it's not. If you think about I know you want to move on, but can I just mention that the other 2 points really quickly? I think because the presentation's about DV housing, I think it's really important that if a victim survivor of domestic and family violence results in a significant disability, so i.e. being a victim of crime, this leads to the victims / survivor staying with the perpetrator because, like you said, the housing options just aren't there. So because I have a disability, the rental market is completely not an option for me to access at the moment until we, develop systems that enable all properties to be accessible. And I think just the added thing is another key point is relationships change. It hurts, it's exhausting, it's isolating, and your connection to community changes. So your connection to your colleagues, to your partners, to your friendships, to your community, it all significantly changes in a way that you can never imagine.
Yeah. And those impacts on those relationships, and also like working, we all understand those, like the economic factors that then happen as a flow on from that in workplaces or trying to find work and supporting. So again, it's just as service providers in trying to ask the right questions, and we all know we're chronically under-resourced and underfunded, but ensuring that for women with disability, there's those extra gaps that people may not be aware of or like thinking about necessarily, and those can be really significant and either mean that person goes back to the place where violence is being perpetrated. Yes. Or that there's a significant gap they need to cover on their own and figure out their own way through, which is just unnecessary. And most people, like if you realize that was happening, you do something to scaffold around it. But it's asking the right questions. So our key findings for service providers are on screen, but what I wanted to jump to as to how service providers can, how you can start to create more accessibility at the back of this research. So we saw that women with disability access the services more, the ones that we worked with, and we had more people identifying as a person with disability as well. And also the research showed that the more women with disability you have as clients, the further increases your accessibility again and again. It compounds because you have those experiences, you can implement your learnings. So we talked about attitude, and the major thing we needed to do was change everyone's attitude to put toward people with disability. That was really key from the findings, that accessibility is no longer an afterthought, is integrated into everything we do. Now, this is something that was the result over a few years of doing the foundation. So these services that managed to achieve these results of accessibility, the foundations were that they acknowledge that access is a human right, that they did an accessibility audit. You can use tools to do your own if you're not able to pay a person with disability to do it for you. And that they had disability awareness and inclusion training, and this was the key factor that changes people's attitudes. You examine your own internal and organisational and procedural policy biases, and that you're working to change those. The way that you do that is through a disability inclusion action plan that helps embed those inclusive policies and procedures. So as service providers, what can you do? And as individuals in your organisations, representation matters. Recruit for diversity. And ensure that you have people in your workforce that are people with disability, because that then becomes a safer place for your clients. They can see that represented, and also people who want to work for you. Intentionally incorporate lived experience. Make sure that the people who are affected by your decision, by the decisions, if they're about them, make sure they're included in that process.
Reinforcing consumer strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then once you have, you've figured out what's accessible and what's not and what you're working on, highlight and promote it. It's so important that your referring networks understand your accessibility and you understand it yourself, so that your clients can understand what's available to them. Because remember that due to the way that people with disability have experienced the world, that they often self-select out of things, and they often like they will not reach out for support because they don't believe it will be safe for them, can often cause more harm than help. Examining those biases, keep strengthening and embedding trauma-informed practice. This alone makes such a difference to people with disability accessing services. And, you know, just a little idea, add inclusion in general to your monthly meeting agenda and start to unpack all that stuff that we've talked about and building those accessible policies and inclusive policies into your organisation. I am not going to go through these low-cost examples, but we are going to go through, I will pop the resources in the chat, our Building Access website, which goes through ways you can make your service more accessible. Simple, easy, low-cost ways. That doesn't have to be expensive. And a guide for policy and practice and creating an inclusion action plan. These were created with DV New South Wales. There's also easy read resources for your clients. Signal that safety in your waiting rooms and in your referrers' waiting rooms, and also a handbook on supporting people with intellectual disability who've experienced violence. That is an excellent, excellent resource. And on the website is a video that will also take you through that resource, and you can train your staff. You can do this together as a team. So I'll pop those in the chat. Or you can scan the QR code here. And then I believe that if you'd like to ask Sal some questions.
Nice. So thank you so much, Karina and Sal. This has been amazing and so insightful. If there's any questions, you can pop them in the chat or pop your hand up, and we can share that with the team.
Come on, someone's got something to say.
I'll quickly just hello, it's Delia, everyone. Just acknowledge Sal, you know, sharing your story and being so open with us today has been beautiful, and I'm really thrilled that you're joining our work here at DV New South Wales. And Karina, again, could literally just get locked into the screen every time you're speaking. So very grateful to both of you for educating and supporting our members. I probably had a question for the members. So I was going to ask, based on some of the things Sal mentioned around having cultural safety frameworks in place. Do members have those things in place, and are there maybe some key reflections from today that will go into those plans? Would be a question I'd put out to our awesome members, if anyone's happy to share. Or any comments from members, any reflections?
We've got a comment in here saying, excellent, insightful presentation. Thank you so much. And another one, agreed. Thank you so much for sharing your lived experience and advocating for people with disabilities. Great and very informative. Such important information and services. Don't know what, I was incredibly grateful to have been a participant in the Building Access project.
Well done.
Amazing. Just to add, I think too, from DV New South Wales, we are partnering with PWDA, and we'll have Sal's input into some additional resources and sort of self-paced knowledge building around disability too. So very excited to be adding to this great resource kit of the Building Access project. Here's a question. Is there a list directory available for refuges in New South Wales with disability access?
No, would be a simple answer to that one. Karina, do you want to respond before I?
There's not, to my knowledge, an actual list, no, but so that is where in your own community it's really useful to highlight and promote your accessibility, acknowledge the limitations of where you don't have accessibility, because that means for one person that can look at it and go, okay, I can see they're accessible in this way, but actually they don't have accommodation that's going to be accessible for me. I'm not going to spend my valuable energy and resources contacting and going down that pathway. So it's a quick reference. They move on to find the next place that can. It helps streamline and save energy, essentially.
Yeah. Could I also add something? You know, I've disclosed that, you know, I'm new to having a disability, and one of the things that I would like to leave people on, in a non-able body world and dealing with the systemic challenges and abuse, as exhausting as it is, I have learnt to model with kindness and a sense of humour, and it does help you balance how exhausting and how frustrating it is to navigate all of these services and systemic barriers.
Thank you, Sal.
Tell them with kindness.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a question, Harley.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. One of the questions I have is, one of the other barriers is with housing and accessible housing for people. Sorry, that's Housing New South Wales. And one of the things that I've noticed is that if you do get an accessible ground floor, it may not be in very good condition. So it may exacerbate asthma with mold or things like that, because a lot of things are cosmetically fixed up. What do you suggest in this sector to be able to address things like that?
Can I speak, Karina? You're right. I would love to see a correlation on the slide that you didn't get to see, that, you know, you can go back and look at the presentation. I do mention the discrepancy between federal initiatives and state initiatives. So I would like to see, based on that, housing and like the federal initiative NDIS network with state initiatives for housing and complement them, because what ends up happening is, you're right, the consumer is stuck in the middle with state federal legislation and with a property that does not meet their needs. So I'd be challenging that, going and it's hard because the service provider will just concentrate on the housing part of it, not the disability, not the DV, not the fact that you're sticking them in housing where there's there's high rates of violence and high rates of chronic illness that they're going to be exposed to anyways. There's a whole bunch of issues relating to that. So one of the biggest things that I would try and get the sector moving towards joining state and federal initiatives. Just as one idea.
Thanks.
Amazing, thank you.
Advocate for your client. If you feel like it's not right, do the right thing, listen to your heart and advocate.
Thank you, Sal. We had another comment in the chat. Love the entire discussion and your amazing work, especially the discussion around cultural differences and just blatant racism with disability. I hope there's more continued work in this space. Now we have 2 more minutes, probably time for one quick question if there's anyone else. Can't see any more hands up.
I think what would be wonderful, just Delia again, sorry, hand up, is for us to kind of reflect on today's session and kind of come back with the members, I think, within 6 months to see what we did, what resources we downloaded, what we put in place, because we did this partnership work with Karina and the team back in 2021, and those resources are so brilliant and so valid. It would be good to hear how we're using them, and I reckon there's so much more to discuss from today. What are your thoughts, Karina, on your kind of research and what we should do as a sector in terms of next steps?
Fantastic. Like, implementing those things. So I like to suggest that people start, again, instead of going, oh, it's all too hard, and then once again putting it in the too hard basket, start with what I like low-hanging fruit, like removing trip hazards from your entranceways so that people can navigate, like rugs, clutter against walls, etc. So it's easier to navigate for people with mobility devices, but also like thinking about stuff like when you do that, it also makes it more accessible for mum who's got a kid on one hip and pushing a pram with another hand, and it inclusion benefits everyone. And so just starting to think about the things as you learn more about disability and inclusion, like what are the things that you can do in your workplace that are easy, just get started, the momentum will happen from there, and that's when you'll start to be able to embed and integrate. Use the resources, give us feedback on the resources, like we could reconvene in 6 months as Delia suggested, and then also, where are the gaps? What do you need? What resources do you need? And then we beg for more funding. We need these resources.
I like it.
Well, thank you so much. We're right on 2 o'clock. So yeah, again, a huge thanks to Sal and Karina for such an insightful presentation. We're so grateful for your time and really value your rich insights and experience. And thank you to everyone for dialing in. If there's any last questions, please email admin and we can do it all offline. But thanks again, everyone.
We'll have a recording of today and all those resources sent back out in the weekly sector chat. And thank you, Sarah, for rock starring facilitation.
Thanks, Steele. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks very much, Karina.
Thanks, Sal. It was
Okay.
great with you. Thanks.
Yeah, working with you, darling.